English translation. 618th contact Saturday, the 21st of March 2015, 14:43 hours.
Hello, here I am again, and I think that before the correction work you were able to read the 2 articles I gave you. Although the one concerning the Dalai Lamas and their ilk and their misanthropic machinations and desecrations of human beings in Tibet, is a bit long.
I was able to read both articles in peace. It was not a problem because I had enough time since I was here an hour earlier before the correction work, as you know.
Of course I know, because I brought you the articles when I received them from Bernadette. But it is also good that we were able to do our obligatory correction work today, because otherwise we would have piled up a lot of work again if today's discussion report had also been added to the others that are still unprocessed. But I have a question here that I brought up once before in a private conversation because I was interested in it. It was about how many psychopaths there were in governments, political offices, and among the population. Now, however, a man from Germany also raised the question, saying that he had read something about psychopaths and narcissists, whereby he was now interested in how often such human beings, precisely psychopaths and narcissists, were to be found in earthly governments and in the Earth's population, or rather how many percentages should be reckoned with among the one and the other.
Psychopaths are usually also narcissistically afflicted, because narcissism is always connected with psychopathy, which, however, makes it difficult for earthly psychologists and psychiatrists to recognize this, or even to be able to determine it. But I am not in a position to give a figure for psychopaths and therefore also narcissists in earthly governments and in the Earth's population, because the numbers in this respect are constantly changing through death and birth processes. Besides, I do not remember the data and have to retrieve them. Yes, here. Our last research in this regard was already 4 years ago, in which the values in relation to psychopath narcissists in all areas of office of the earthly rulers, governments, and administrations, etc., show a changing average of approx. 72, 78%, calculated on the basis of the total number of all rulers of all governments, offices, and administrations, etc. With regard to psychopath narcissists in the total earthly population, our research showed an average of 24–27%.
That is steep, which is why it is no wonder that all the peoples of Earth are ruled by madmen and lunatics, and why riots, revolutions, acts of terrorism, and wars are constantly being launched. So it is also not surprising that the powerful of the EU dictatorship and the USA are on the verge of starting a new big war by harassing and challenging Russia with sanctions, etc., as well as with vicious demands, with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel playing a particularly nasty role. On the one hand out of her own nasty impulse, and on the other hand because she is being abused by the USA as a willing and welcome puppet. In fact, another hot war is already just around the corner, which could very quickly degenerate into a world war, because not only the EU dictatorship, but also the USA are working underhandedly against Russia, which should effectively be shown more understanding for its policies instead of harassing it with sanctions and demands that are solely aimed at a huge benefit for the EU dictatorship, the USA and NATO. Although Germany is always portrayed as the bad child when it comes to harassing Russia, the truth is that it is not Germany or the German people, but Chancellor Merkel and her cohorts, in cooperation with all the powerful EU dictatorship and the USA, who are at the forefront. The truth is that it is not the German people who are in charge in Germany, but the Chancellor Merkel and her cohorts, as well as the EU dictatorship and the USA. All of these powers have no understanding for Russia's situation, and that is precisely the point, because the entire West, above all the EU dictatorship, the USA and Angela Merkel, must quickly change their policy towards Russia, otherwise it can no longer be ruled out. Otherwise, it can no longer be ruled out that the Ukraine conflict will turn into a hot war, which could end in a new world war. The fourth, because there have already been 3 world wars, although the first one from 1756 to 1763 is being concealed and described as only a 7-year war, against one's better judgment. And if I want to address Putin's interests, then I think that according to his efforts as they are disseminated in the political news, he is directing them towards China, Pakistan, and the Central Asian former Soviet republics. I don't think he has much interest in Ukraine, because I think this is likely to be limited to Crimea and eastern Ukraine, because there are many Russian speakers and Russian descendants living there. However, what the EU dictatorship and the USA are doing against Russia, aiming at an eastward expansion and fabricating a missile defense and other bulwark against Russia, with lies that everything is only directed against possible attacks, especially nuclear attacks, from Iran, corresponds on the one hand to nothing more than cowardly fear, and on the other hand to a hidden expansion of power, which is being pursued first and foremost by the USA, because they want nothing more and nothing less than the role of the world police and world domination. So it is that on the one hand the EU dictatorship is extending its claws into Europe and beyond, aligning itself with US policy, and the latter in turn with EU dictatorship policy, preventing Germany from finding a truly independent political line. But this can only be found without Chancellor Merkel and her followers, because as long as they are at the helm and the USA is directing the German government, nothing can change for the better and good, but only for the worse and worse. And since this is indeed the case, there is today, as there has not been for a very long time, a very great danger that at least a Europe-wide warlike conflagration will break out, if not a war that will one day engulf the whole world. All the rulers of the EU dictatorship, Germany and the USA, are obviously unaware of this danger and do not see the parallels, as they also used to be, which led to vicious world wars in 1914 and 1939. In a frightening way, the old events are repeating themselves in the present time, and if these repetitions are not quickly stopped and reason is given place, then catastrophe can no longer be avoided.
Which unfortunately is indeed the truth.
Good. Then something else, because I want to ask you, what is it about bloodletting and hypertension when blood pressure lowering food and drugs do not help?
Then there is indeed the possibility of regular bloodletting.
Yes, there is, but I am interested in knowing more about it. So if you could please explain something about this in a way that is also understandable without much medical knowledge.
Regular bloodletting can be done through a normal blood collection, such as a blood donation, which can be done every 2 to 3 months, or more often if necessary. This can lower blood pressure and also improve physical well-being. However, this has nothing to do with the traditional bloodletting Greek phlebotomy or Latin missio sanguinis, which was a well-known and widespread method on Earth from antiquity until the 19th century, and was used as an alleged cure for many diseases and ailments, but as a rule only corresponded to nonsensical assumptions, because bloodletting only has a positive effect on a few diseases. Bloodletting is a procedure in which a considerable amount of blood is taken from a patient. In colloquial language, blood donation or blood collection is also occasionally referred to as phlebotomy nowadays. Regular blood donations can lower high blood pressure. A complex mechanism regulates blood pressure, whereby the blood vessels, biochemical messengers, the nervous system, and the organs interact with each other. The iron content of the blood also plays a very important role, because an excess of iron is harmful, although this can be reduced by bloodletting or blood sampling. So a low iron level lowers the blood pressure and also helps to balance the blood pressure better and also keeps the vessel walls elastic.
Thanks. Your short explanation should probably suffice. Then to the little article from the magazine Schweizer Illustrierte that you read regarding water, that is to say the daily liquid requirement of human beings, to which the new medical findings now confirm what you have been saying all along. I have spoken with you and Quetzal on various occasions over the years about drinking water, tea and coffee, etc. I have taken this from the 199th contact. I have copied the following from the 199th contact report from the 3rd of February 1985 and the 230th contact report from the 11th of October 1989, to which I then added the small article from the journal Schweizer Illustrierte.
199th contact, the 3rd of February, 1985.
Well, The point is that my doctor told me, as did various other people by the way, including core group members, that for health reasons I had to drink at least 2-3 liters of water or tea, etc. per day, because that was necessary for human beings. For my part, however, I have never drunk much since I can remember, not even in the desert where it was always quite hot. I was always content with a small glass of hot tea or a small Arabic or Turkish coffee. It is also rare that I am really thirsty and drink more than usual. But I still feel good and cannot complain that I have any complaints because of the little I drink. But other people keep saying that they drink several liters of fluid a day because that's the way it has to be. As a doctor, what do you think about that?
The fluid requirement of human beings is basically different, so one needs more than the other.
But that does not quite answer my question. Besides, I would like to say that sometimes I do not take any fluids for several days, if I refrain from 1 or 2 cups of coffee. Sometimes I even refrain from doing that.
I am familiar with that. But by way of further explanation, I would like to say that on Earth there is a general misconception among human beings, and especially among medical men, that larger quantities of liquid are important for human needs. However, this is only partly the case because this only refers to human beings who have a greater need for fluids, which, however, varies greatly from individual to individual. For example, there are human beings whose daily need for fluids is very high, while others get by with very little and find drinking water or tea and other fluids torturous if they have to drink without really being thirsty. Not being thirsty, however, means that the body, etc., does not need fluids, and not even to flush out toxins, etc. If more is drunk than thirst requires, or if there are compelling reasons for illness, then this can cause indisposition or even damage to health.
That is obvious to me. And in fact, I always feel unwell too if I have to drink something without really being thirsty. I even have to constantly force myself to drink a glass of tea or water when I take my medication, because the liquid really makes me retch due to the lack of thirst and often makes me gasp for air.
This is understandable to me, but you will probably not be able to avoid taking the little liquid you have to wash down the medication with. So you will have to cope with the retching, as you call it. But do not let false opinions force you to take larger quantities of liquids every day, unless thirst demands it. The opinion that the human being needs at least 2 to 3 liters or even more of liquid daily is a false doctrine which, if followed, can lead to nasty damage to health. In reality, such a need for fluids applies to only a part of all human beings, whereby the causes for this are illness-related or are based on reasons of real thirst, such as through heat and warmth or through sweat-inducing exertion of the body, by which I am also referring to a corresponding work.
230th contact, the 11th of October, 1989.
But there is also the problem that many know-it-alls, such as doctors, professors, nutrition experts, and others, who want to know everything better, claim that a lot of liquid must be drunk at high heat temperatures. However, I have had quite different experiences in this respect, namely that only very little. And if anything, only a little hot tea or coffee should be drunk when it is very hot, because any other liquid is immediately sweated out again, and thirst increases accordingly. Alcohol of any kind should not be drunk in hot weather, because it can cause a circulatory collapse and heat accumulation.
This is of correctness. Alcohol of any kind should be avoided at all costs in hot weather, as it can cause life-threatening reactions. The higher the heat temperatures rise, the less should be drunk. Too much liquid can be fatal because it flushes out too much vital substances from the brain and body. If drinking is necessary, then only hot drinks such as tea, coffee, or other equivalent drinks should be given to the body in small quantities. If the body is supplied with large quantities of liquid, and in addition cool or even cold, then this will be excreted again by the body in the form of sweating, or it will lead to death. Drinking a lot is therefore not harmless, because with sweating, vital salts, as well as converted vitamins and minerals and trace elements are also excreted, which severely impairs the body's function in all organs, leads to death or to attacks of weakness. Malaise, listlessness, tiredness, nausea, anxiety, dizziness, or to all kinds of other effects, whereby such can also be life-threatening, as for example in the case of heat accumulation.
But tell me, we talked about this a while ago, regarding drinking. You said that too much liquid washes out salts, minerals, trace elements, and vitamins from the brain and the body, which leads to all kinds of ills and even death. But since our doctors and all sorts of other people keep saying that at least 2 to 3 liters of water or something equivalent must be drunk every day, the question arises as to what measure must be taken as a starting point, where harmfulness to the body and brain arises.
This depends on the need of the brain and the whole body, the organs and the muscles, etc. So thirst is not simply thirst, because many human beings drink a lot because they imagine they are thirsty, although their body does not need any supplying fluid. The more they drink, the more fluids that are saturated in the body and brain with vital salts, trace elements, vitamins, and minerals, they excrete again through sweating and urination. Therefore, the rule is that fluids should only be drunk when really thirsty, and they should be measured according to physical exertion. At the highest and greatest physical exertion, a measure of not more than 3.3 to 15.15 decilitres of pure fluid such as water, tea, or coffee with little or no sugar applies. In hot weather, it is advisable and of the greatest benefit to drink water, tea, or coffee as hot as possible. Otherwise, cool drinks may also be drunk in equal quantities and in small sips. If there is no great physical exertion, it is highly advisable to keep fluids reduced to such an extent that one only drinks when really thirsty. This means that it may not be necessary to give the body any special fluids, because food alone is sufficient to give the brain and body, etc., the necessary fluids. However, if too much is drunk, this not only causes damage in the form mentioned several times, but the brain function is also negatively affected. This means that the ability to think and the emotional function, as well as the ability to reason, self-responsibility, and the ability to make logical decisions are also affected, as well as the capacity of intelligence, which is reduced and paralyzed.
So much for these excerpts, which I think are sufficient to explain the facts because it is clear from them what we are talking about.
More should really not be necessary.
Exactly, because everything is explained clearly enough.
To this I would only say that it is good that better knowledge is at last being gained in this matter, whereby much evil may be remedied among Earth humans if they will engage to follow the new knowledge.
So then I immediately add to my present words the little article from the magazine Schweizer Illustrierte, which, as I said, I received from Bernadette. She also found it in the magazine and read some of it out in the kitchen. I found the whole thing interesting and said that I would show you the article and also copy out a few extracts from the contact conversation blocks for our conversation, and then add them to what we just talked about.
Note: the relevant newspaper articles are inserted on pages 181 and 182.
So far then, these extracts, though I do not think any more are necessary. Apparently the Earthlings, or rather the medical experts, are becoming wiser after all, for new findings are now being revealed with regard to the drinking of water, tea and coffee, etc., whereby the explanations of Quetzal and yourself are confirmed.
To which there is nothing more to be said, for enough information emerges from the interview report excerpts and from the journal article in the magazine Schweizer Illustrierte.
If there are any new findings on this matter, which can certainly be expected in the course of time, then we can talk about it again, which will also inform the readers of the contact reports. I think that's good, because in our contact reports we deal with a lot of things and information that hardly ever, if ever, gets out to the public, so the human beings of Earth are only sparsely informed about it, or not at all.
But in many cases, this is also due to the fact that many Earth humans are not interested in certain things.
Which you are also right about, because actually a lot of Earthlings just live in the day and do not care about what changes and advances are being made in the various sciences, in technology, and in many other ways. Consequently, they simply live indifferently and disinterestedly into the day and into the future, without perceiving what is actually happening around them, how all development and life etc. are going on. As a result, interpersonal relationships in general also suffer, which have given way to complete indifference, both with regard to the human beings themselves, and also with regard to the earth, nature, and its fauna and flora.
Which unfortunately is indeed the case.
And which can only be changed if each individual human being strives for his own change and betterment, and pursues a healthy self-knowledge in order to transform himself personally into a human being who obeys the creational natural laws and recommendations, and accordingly consciously adapts all his modes of conduct and his actions and deeds in accordance with these laws and recommendations willfully and joyfully.
Which is the only path that can be followed to lead everything to the better and truly good, as well as to the creatively naturally correctness. And to this article here in relation to the explanations and the descriptions from the book The Shadow of the Dalai Lama, it is to be said that effective facts are mentioned, which, however, on the one hand are not accepted as truth by the believers who follow the Dalai Lama, and on the other hand by various governments of various countries as well as by many of the world's population, whereby blinded faith reasons play just as large a role as also profit reasons in relation to secret service, political and economic machinations, etc.
I will also add the other article that appeared in the journal Taxi under the title Der Schleiermacher by Martin Ulrich, which is sold by unemployed people who can earn a supplement to their welfare money. The article is freely available and published by the editors of Taxi for Figu, and is a treatment of the book The Shadow of the Dalai Lama, 816 pages, by Victor and Victoria Tremondi, published by Patmos in 1999. The content of the article in the book is about the Dalai Lamas etc., and their inhumane, misanthropic, and inhuman machinations in Tibet. Unfortunately, there are no more books about this article in bookshops, because they are sold out. Some people say that the majority of the 1999 edition was bought up and destroyed by Dalai Lama friends. Whether this really corresponds to the facts is unfortunately not known. The book is unfortunately out of print, but may still be found as read copies in second-hand bookshops and at Amazon. Similarly to this book, The Shadow of the Dalai Lama, there is another work worth reading by an author called Colin Goldner, entitled The Case of a God King, 2nd edition, 2008 expanded, 736 pages, ISBN 733532866569, 02121 from Albini Verlag, Aschaffenburg, although this book, which is also worth reading, is still available in bookshops, so it can still be bought by those interested.
Which will certainly be the case according to the aforementioned article.
Exactly, that's what I'm talking about. But now I want to talk about something which I myself have always bumped up against, namely the term prophet, which is also foisted upon me and about which I am not at all pleased. If I have made prophecies, then I have simply proclaimed or even prophesied these, hence one could maybe call me proclaimer or prophesizer. And if I now fulfill the mission and bring the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, then one can call me mission fulfiller, or plainly and simply teacher, in which case this naming even appeals to me, but prophet not at all. The term prophet is unfortunately quite ancient and based on the fact that former proclaimers of prophecies were simply called as such, not however according to what the real reason of their work was, precisely the teaching of the spiritual teaching, that is to say the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life. Hence the prophecies fundamentally proclaimed the bringer of the teaching and therefore were teachers, just as I see myself as such and not as a prophet. I have made only a few prophecies, and also make only a few such today, whereby it is also to be noted that prophecies as a rule are based on probability calculations, dreams and visions, which can both fulfill themselves as well as not be fulfilled. And indeed, according to how the causes have been dealt with and the corresponding effects proceeding from them, follow. Therefore, the prophecies are changeable. This completely in contrast to predictions, such I've indeed made many, and which undoubtedly also fulfill themselves in each case. And if one wanted, therefore, according to these, instead of calling me prophet, then predictor would probably apply. Thus, the designation prophet, I find, has something objectionable, religious, and sectarian in itself, quite the contrary to it or to teacher, which is also why this is a reason for me that I reject this term. I have also spoken about it with Eva and Bernadette, who both are also of the opinion that for me one should simply use the designation teacher, because prophet is really characterized very strongly in a religious sectarian wise, as I also am of the same opinion.
What you say, I can understand. And indeed also with regard to the fact that your words correspond to the rightness. By you saying that the term prophet is to be interpreted religious sectarianly, because since time immemorial, and up into the present time, someone is thus described by the earth human who has fallen into a purely religious or a sectarian belief and feels called upon by their God to proclaim the godly truth as a prophetic admonisher and seer. In this wise, such a human being of earth will be recognized, treated, and often also worshipped and adored by the religious and sectarian believers as a religious authority. However, in the sense of the bringing, teaching and communicating of the spiritual teaching, that is to say, the teaching of the prophets, that is to say, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, there is solely and exclusively the teaching, but no prophecies. However, might beyond the bringing of the teaching of the teacher's prophetic statements or effective predictions, then these do not stand in direct connection with the teaching, but in relation to logical thinking with regard to combinations of happenings, probability calculations, real dreams, and real visions. Nevertheless, all these values are not based in the teaching, but in the consciousness-based capabilities of the prophesying and predictive person. The origin of the term prophet, however, is found in the ancient Greek language, namely in the word prophetes, which means, for example, proclaimer of oracular sayings, as well as seer and soothsayer. In the term prophetes, it amounts to two pieced-together words, pro, which means before, and pheme, which is to be interpreted as speech or speaking. Furthermore, from this the term phanai follows, which means so much as speaking, from which in turn follows the term prophanai, which is to be understood as predict or proclaim. The whole thing was already adopted very early from Christianity and from Islam and implemented in all the languages of the believers who belong to these religions and their sects, which was thus retained until the present day and has general validity in all decisive fields of language. With regard to the spiritual teaching, teaching of the prophets, that is to say, teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, as well as naming those human beings who bring, teach, and spread this teaching, the term teacher should fundamentally be used, as you have also said this yourself. Also, the terms prophet or mission fulfiller could be used, as also, nevertheless, prophesier, if the corresponding teacher just makes prophecies, which clearly puts the possibilities of coming happenings and so forth. If set causes are pursued further and cannot someday be changed for the better, therefore they ultimately lead to the prophesied effects. Only in this sense can a prophesizer person be seen and understood. If they are called as prophet or prophetess or come forth as a male or female proclaimer, admonisher, caller, and seer, as well as warner. However, what now results from this, that one calls yourself a prophet, is thus based simply in the fact that you've made and also continue to make diverse prophecies, if you so desire it, but this designation may be absolutely omitted for your person and your work. because the whole of this term does not correspond to what you are effectively doing, namely teaching and spreading the spiritual teaching. That is to say, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life. Therefore, plainly and simply, you should rightly also be called teacher. And this designation should also be taken into account even though you have made certain prophecies. And that you have also made a great number of predictions as a predictor, that over the course of time have fulfilled as well and continue to fulfill themselves, just as also certain prophecies. That also does not change the fact that you are a teacher of the spiritual teaching, that is to say, the teaching of the truth. Teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, and teach and spread this teaching. Thus, you should also be referred to as teacher and as nothing else.
This I can be pleased with, and it also says that I have nothing to do with so-called black magic, with clairvoyance, religion, sectarianism, fortune-telling, magic, and the like, or similar things. Then once again I have a question here, which relates to the following excerpt from the conversation of the 230th official contact from the 11th of October, 1989. We once talked about the Lake Ness, Loch Ness in Scotland, in connection with the so-called Nessie, which is supposed to be a dinosaur, for which, however, no proof of existence could be produced until today. But you said that such a creature actually existed in Loch Ness and that it was not a fairy tale. I would like to see the creature. Can you take me there?
In fact, there are 2 parents and a young one. These are water-dwelling predatory dinosaurs, that is to say, Plesiosaurus, which have survived for many generations. Their existence will be very difficult to prove, however, because the animals rarely move to higher waters or even to the surface of the water in such a way that they can be sighted. We have been observing these distant dinosaur descendants for many years, and in the course of our research, we have also found fossils of their most distant ancestors. But we have left them at the sites where they may one day be found by Earth paleontologists or other Earth humans. Naturally, I will take you there so that you can see the animals, but you will have to keep quiet about this in public for the next 12 years.
I will. I will also pretend to be ignorant when I ask more questions later. Well, Quetzal showed me one of the aforementioned animals in its element, and the 12 years during which I was supposed to keep my mouth shut are also long gone. He also did not say why I should keep quiet. Now, however, stories have been circulating on the internet and television for a long time that some people have seen the so-called Nessie, and have also been tested with the latest lie detectors for their statements of truth and have been found to be genuine in this respect. By this I mean that the statements of these persons are said to be true according to the lie detector, that is to say that they are said to have actually seen Nessie, or a plesiosaur. In addition, a plesiosaur carcass is said to have been fished out of the sea about 50 kilometers east of New Zealand in 1977, and then thrown back again, as Japanese sailors report, as this observation report says, which I copied from the internet using the search term New Zealand Monster 1977. There is also a picture of the carcass, which is also referred to as the New Zealand Monster. Can you say something about this? Because about 25 years ago, Quetzal and I last talked about plesiosaurs. And although he said at the time that you would continue to do research on these critters and that he would report back to me sooner or later, he unfortunately did not do so. So here's the observation report and a picture from Wikipedia.
Yeno, New Zealand, about 30 nautical miles 50 kilometers, east of Christchurch, Japanese fishing boat Zui Amaru.
Observations, 1977. A few years ago, a Japanese fishing boat is said to have found a good preserved carcass of a plesiosaurus, although these animals have been extinct for millions of years. This sensational find was then thrown overboard because the captain was more interested in the fish he had caught. Is that true? In fact, on 25.4, 1977, the Japanese fishing boat Zui Maru caught an approximately 10-meter long, 2-ton, half-decayed carcass of an animal about 30 nautical miles, 50 kilometers, east of Christchurch, New Zealand, which nobody on board could identify. It was thrown back into the sea, but production manager Michihiko Yano had the opportunity to take some size measurements, collect tissue samples, and borrow a camera beforehand. His 5 photos soon caused a stir in the world press. The animal's apparently long, thin neck was reminiscent of a plesiosaurus, an interpretation also held by the Fisheries Society at its press conference on 20.7. 1977, the Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun quoted the head of the Animal Research Department of the National Science Museum in Tokyo, Professor Yoshinori Imaizumi, as saying, "It is not a fish, whale, or other mammal. It looks very much like a plesiosaurus." The Washington Post, Boston Globe, New York Times, New Scientist, and others also reported the find. Not since Godzilla had a monster so gripped Japan Glen Kuban. Toy manufacturers put models on the market. A Japanese plesiosaurus stamp appeared on 2.11. And even the manufacturer of Yano's camera advertised with the sea monster photos. The long, thin neck, the Nessie-like appearance of this carcass made me think of a plesiosaurus. What was this animal? Michihiko Yano himself apparently saw it as a plesiosaurus. His sketch of the animal clearly shows a plesiosaurus and bears the description, capture of a Nessie-like carcass. However, the sketch was made from memory only 2 months after the capture, and it contradicts the photos in some details. For example, the dorsal fin visible in one of the photos is missing. A solution to the mystery came to light in July 1978, when a working group published the results of extensive investigations in a report for the Société Franco-Japonaise d'Oceanographie. Everything pointed to a basking shark. The analysis of the tissue samples with various methods show that the tissue comes from a shark. Various anatomical details of the photos and the sketch speak against a plesiosaur. Plesiosaurs, for example, have at least 13 cervical vertebrae, while the carcass had 6 or 7 Yano. Also, the shape of the head, the ligaments along the spine, the dorsal fin and other features fit a shark, but not a reptile, and by no means a plesiosaur. But what about the long, thin neck that is so atypical for a shark? The basking shark Cetahynus maximus feeds on plankton by swimming leisurely under the surface of the water with its mouth wide open, filtering the plankton through its huge gill apparatus. Therefore, the lower jaw and gill apparatus is only weakly attached to the rest of the body and is usually the first to be lost when the animal decays. What remains is the cervical spine with the relatively small skull, which gives the carcass a Nessie-like appearance. This phenomenon has been known for a long time and has already earned the basking shark the nickname Pseudoplesiosaurus cohen, D. The Encyclopedia of Monsters, New York, 1982. It is true that preliminary results of the tissue samples had already been presented to the public on 25.7. 1977, a few days after the publication of the photos, and critical biologists had pointed out the possibility of a confusion with a basking shark early on. However, this did not disturb the monster enthusiasm, and the 1978 analysis was also hardly noticed. In creationist literature in particular, it lives on as an unsolved mystery that supposedly contradicts the theory of evolution. Glen Kuban lists 19 publications from the period between 1984 and 1997 that refer to the carcass as a plesiosaurus, most of which, according to Cuban, seem to be unaware of the results of the study Cuban, sea monster or shark. Report of the National Center for Science Education, 173, May-June 1997, 16-2-28. A sketch by Glenn J. Cuban is supposed to prove that the captured plesiosaur was a basking shark. The question remains, how does one interpret the pronounced backbone, the actual characteristic of a mammal or also a dinosaur, with the vertebrae clearly visible in the various photos? The shark is a cartilaginous fish and does not normally have a backbone.
I am as familiar with the various writings on the internet as I am with what you have here as an observation report. And may I say that since your conversation with Quetzal, we have continued to research these sea creatures and have finally been able to find a total of 6 younger and 23 older specimens in the Atlantic Ocean, as well as in the Pacific Ocean, in Loch Ness and in the South Seas. And as far as the Yano Internet Report is concerned, it is to be said that all descriptions and representations as well as claims of earthly experts concerning the carcass absolutely do not correspond to the correctness, because the carcass hoisted onto the Japanese ship Zuyo Maru was in fact a deceased plesiosaurus. I investigated this myself out of my own interest by looking back and found that it was undoubtedly the mortal remains of such a sea creature, a male plesiosaur, that is.
So it was not a basking shark, as is claimed. However, Quetzal said nothing to me about this incident with the carcass in 1989 or at any later time, except that you were going to continue searching the seas for plesiosaurs.
If you did not ask him about these creatures anymore, then he probably just did not feel the need to bring up the conversation himself, especially because I was in charge of researching everything in detail. Probably Quetzal, who was not involved in the investigation of the matter himself, also thought that I would inform you, but I neglected to do so because we always had other things to talk about and you did not ask about them either. Nor did Quetzal inform me that I should report to you in due course on the results of our research, in which we also made probability calculations with regard to how many undiscovered living beings still exist on Earth on land, air, and water, as well as in the soil.
Yes, that was talked about once. I remember that. And I remember you talking about a number of about 12 million undiscovered life forms in all areas of Earth.
That is correct. It is unfortunate that there was a failure to inform you when Quetzal had promised to inform you.
After all, the world will not end because of it, and besides, it is quite enough that you inform me today. But why did he impose a 12-year silence on me? I do not understand.
In 1989, we had planned to do a 12-year research in all the seas in many ways. So, on the one hand, it was necessary to keep your silence, and on the other hand, that no written records of conversations were made by you in relation to our research program. Of course, the whole thing should not become known to the Earth humans, so that they could not have observed and disturbed us during our research. But this would inevitably have happened, precisely that we would have been observed, disturbed, and that our research plans would possibly have been made impossible because you had recorded the contact conversation reports in writing and passed them on, as they were also fraudulently stolen from you, along with films and photos, by a person from your family, copied and passed on and sent to dubious people in Switzerland, Germany, and the USA. If some or all of our plesiosaur studies had become known in certain circles, especially in the USA, Canada, Russia, England, or China, this would inevitably have led to serious disruption or abandonment with regard to our research program, which was very important to us.
That's news again, though I think it is very good that you each do not tell me certain things. Because you never know if you write something too much openly when you're putting articles on paper, for example, or that you blurt things out due to carelessness.
Which will hardly be the case with you. But nevertheless, your statement is to be taken seriously, because really unintentional carelessness can appear, and also when special attention is paid to something that is supposed to be concealed.
That's what I'm saying. That's why I'm also happy for you to keep anything secret if you think it's necessary.
Which in no way implies a distrust of you, dear friend.
I certainly do not think anything of the sort, for I know very well that you trust me implicitly. On the other hand, I would like to remind you that already at the beginning of our contacts in 1975, I gave my promise that I would never cause myself to betray your trust, just as I would never do or say anything that would amount to a betrayal. I also told your daughter Simyase at that time, as I have also repeated to you and Quetzal, that I wish never to be informed by you of things which must generally be kept secret, which is to be for your protection as well as mine.
That is in accordance with correctness and truth, and that honors you. But now, dear friend, I want to tell you that Florena, Njana, Quetzal, and I will be absent and unavailable for the next 2 weeks, for we have very important things to do, which is why we will be staying with my daughter, Simyase, and with Asket and Nera. Under certain circumstances, our absence may also last longer than 2, and so up to 3 weeks. The duties of Florina and Njana will be taken over by 2 other persons, namely by 2 men who are not known to you. That they visit you may well be possible, but it is not foreseen.
Well, that is the way it is, and it cannot be changed. So I wish you all the best and much joy for what you have to do. And please, give everyone my warmest and best wishes.
It will be as much a pleasure for me to do this as it will be for everyone to receive your greetings and wishes. But now I will go, dear friend, if you have nothing more for us to discuss.
No, that is not the case. Then I wish you and everyone else a good time, as well as much joy and success. Goodbye and farewell, Ptah, dear friend.